Hey everyone, this is a piece by Ingo Elbe. It's titled Postcolonialism, Antisemitism, and Israel, the quote, progressive attack on the Jewish state and Holocaust memory. The debate about the relation between, quote, postcolonial studies and anti-Semitism has been ongoing in the German public sphere for several years. What began with the controversy of Achille Mbembe's statements and political engagement in early 2020 has developed into a permanent media, political, and academic controversy. Achille, I don't know if I'm even saying his name right. So, Achille Mbembe, born 1957, is a Cameroonian historian and political theorist who is a research professor in history and politics at the Wits Institute for Social and Economic Research at the University of Witwatersrand. He is well known for his writings on colonialism and its consequences, and is a leading figure in New Wave French critical theory. Back to the text. Arguments are going on about a, quote, activist social science, end quote, in the context of the anti-Israel boycott campaign, BDS, anti-Zionist traditions of post-colonial studies, conflicting definitions of anti-Semitism, the relationship between the Shoah and colonial crimes, and the culture of Holocaust remembrance. Many motifs of this current debate can already be found in past controversies. Post-colonial theorists consistently tie in with the early analyses and statements on the Holocaust by Hannah Arendt, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Aimé Césaire from the early 1950s. They further develop considerations put forward by the doyen of, quote, post-colonial studies, Edward Said, in his 1978 work, Orientalism, or continue the argument about the singularity of the Holocaust that preoccupied U.S. genocide studies in the mid-1990s. In current media discourse, reference is also made to the so-called Historikerstreit, historians' dispute, of 1986/87 over the question of the comparability of Stalinism and the Holocaust over supposed causal relations between them and the consequences of German remembrance policy. Despite all the inconsistencies in the field of, quote, post-colonial studies, similar patterns of argumentation can still be discerned within this discourse. At this point, I would speak of a systematic connection of 5 moments, which can be presented here only in the form of a brief overview. Footnote. For more detailed studies, please refer to the articles I've collected in a bibliography on the subject. And footnote. Section 1. Despecification of anti-Semitism. First, we are dealing with the conceptual despecification of anti-Semitism and its dissolution into racism or Orientalism. The central idea of the Orientalism approach is that, quote, European culture gained in strength and identity by setting itself off against the Orient as a sort of ... underground self, end quote. Edward Said. This identity, Said claims, consists primarily of projections of negative or desired parts of the West's self, with the West attesting to the Orient's cultural backwardness, stasis, and primitiveness, and justifying a claim to dominance by means of these attributions. Along this process, Jews and Muslims/Arabs are said to have been stylized equally as the, quote, Semitic barbarian other, end quote. And anti-Semitism has thus always been, quote, anti-Semitism. It's in the first one it says anti-Semitism as it's conventionally spelled, anti-Semitism. In this one it's anti-Semitism, how it used to be spelled. The general thing is that usually the Semitism, the anti-Semites are against is a construction. At least that's what I believe the reason for the change from the usual anti-Semitism to anti-Semitism to anti-Semitism, one word. According to Said, anti-Jewish and anti-Arab enemy images are, quote, essentially the same, end quote, quote, figure, end quote. Echoing this idea, Berkeley ethnic studies professor Ramon Gross-Foguel writes, quote, anti-Semitism has had two components from its beginning, quote, anti-Jewish anti-Semitism, end quote, and, quote, anti-Arab Muslim anti-Semitism, end quote, end quote. Gross-Foguel. And Wikipedia says Ramon Gross-Foguel, born 1956, is a Puerto Rican sociologist who belongs to the modernity/coloniality group, who is professor emeritus of Chicano/Latino studies in the Department of Ethnic Studies at the University of California, Berkeley. Back to the text. Literary scholar Gil Anijar outright speaks of, quote, Orientalism, aka Islamophobia, aka anti-Semitism, end quote. And it seems like Gil Anidar or Gil Anijar is a professor in the departments of religion and the departments of Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African studies. Back to the text. The French philosopher Etienne Balibar even sees in the differentialist cultural racism of the present a form of, quote, generalized anti-Semitism, end quote. Balibar, and claims that Arab hatred and Jew hatred are characterized by substantially identical enemy images. Related currents such as, quote, critical whiteness studies also tie in with this idea, attempting to conceptualize anti-Semitism in categories of anti-black racism. Here the emphasis on the specificity of anti-Semitism is rejected as a strategy of privileged whites. Quote, to elevate a form of racism, in this case anti-Semitism, to a class of its own, ... is in truth a further manifestation of the privileged position of whites, end quote, says Farid Essek, for example. Farid Essek is a South African Muslim scholar, writer, and political activist known for his opposition to apartheid, his appointment by Nelson Mandela as a gender equity commissioner, and his work for interreligious dialogue. End footnote. Back to the text. Critical whiteness studies often advocate the thesis of the whitening of the formerly allegedly, quote, less than white, end quote. Jews after 1945 because they had supposedly risen to the middle class in the USA and became part of Western imperialism in the form of Israel, ushering in the end of their, quote, systemic discrimination. For Enzo Traverso, this marked the end of anti-Semitism. While the Jews had penetrated the heart of the West mechanisms of dominance after 1945, the Muslims were now taking on the role of the Jews of old, as Traverso puts it. Footnote. See Traverso, 2017, quote, Jews today find themselves at the center of the dispositive of domination, end quote. And also Traverso, quote, Islamophobia is taking on the role in the new racism that anti-Semitism used to play, end quote. Traverso. End footnote. This anti-racist theorization of anti-Semitism can thus fit seamlessly into classic anti-Jewish stereotypes of the privileged Jew and the resentment against, quote, the powers that be, end quote. Footnote. For criticism of the anti-racist perpetuation of this anti-Semitic motif, see also Berkowitz, 2018. Such theses about Jews as part of the group of privileged whites provide the basis for openly anti-Semitic positions that believe that Jews are the privileged group among privileged whites, as was the case in a series of flyers distributed at the University of Chicago in 2017, quote, "Ending white privilege starts with ending Jewish privilege," end quote. End footnote. David Schraub calls this the accelerant effect of the attribution of Jews as white. The thematization of whiteness in critical whiteness theory is intended to point out certain, quote, privileges among non-Jewish whites that these whites do not even recognize as such. They see themselves as, quote, just a person, end quote, and are neither particularly powerful or influential in their self-perception nor in the perception of society. Jews, on the other hand, are often not seen by society as normal people, but as, quote, particularly powerful or privileged or influential, unquote. Schraub. The topos of the white Jew thus served not as a, quote, counterweight, but as an accelerant, end quote. And the anti-Semite sees himself confirmed, quote, I always thought that the Jews had all this power and privilege, quote, I always thought that Jews had all this power and privilege, and see how right I was, end quote. Schraub. The notion of the privileged Jew ultimately takes on a, quote, bridging function, between right and left-wing ideology, end quote. Schraub. In addition, the religious group with the highest approval rate worldwide for explicitly anti-Semitic stereotypes is chosen as the New Jews. Footnote. See inter alia ADL 2014, Yekeli 2014, Yekeli 2020, Yekeli 2020b, 2020c, Koopmans 2020, AGC 2022. The approval rates for explicitly anti-Semitic statements in a worldwide survey conducted by the Anti-Defamation League were between 17 and 24% among Buddhists, Hindus, atheists, and Christians, and 49% among Muslims. In a representative survey conducted by the American Jewish Committee in Germany in 2022, Muslims were also twice as likely to agree with anti-Semitic statements as the rest of the population. Quote, the 16 countries with the highest levels of anti-Semitic attitudes worldwide in 2014, according to the Anti-Defamation League study, are all majority Muslim, end quote. Yekeli. I think it's Gunter Yekeli. I'm not sure. End footnote. Iman Attia, professor of diversity studies in Berlin, even says, quote, the fear of Muslim world domination implied in the term, quote, Islamophobia has replaced conspiracy myths about Jewish world domination, end quote. It says that Iman, this is from the Gorky Theater. I don't know. It says Iman Attia is an educationalist and professor for critical diversity studies with a focus on racism at the Alice Solomon University, Berlin. Iman Attia's work concentrates on interdisciplinary, comparative, and relational racism research, in particular on anti-Semitism, anti-Muslim and colonial racism, anti-colonial, anti-racist, and diasporic voices and movements. Iman Attia's current research projects are school segregation in the past and present and the power of interpretation and action of Muslims in the face of security discourse and threat scenario. Her last publication with Miriam Popal was published by Unrast Publishing House. Back to the text. The phantasm of the shared, quote, anti-Semitic, end quote, anti-Semitic, end quote, victimization theory of Jews and Muslims or Arabs, and the legend of the peaceful coexistence of Jews and Muslims in Islamic dominant societies until the 20th century served to trivialize traditional and modern Islamic hostility towards Jews. Narrations like these portray the majority of Jews after 1945 as traitors to this history of victimization. Indeed, as with Gros Fouguel or the French philosopher, Maoist douchebag, Alain Badiou, as new anti-Semites who are themselves responsible for the hatred of Israel in the Islamic world. There's a footnote that says, surveys in Europe and the USA from 2019 and 2020 state that 73% of European Jews consider support for Israel to be important, and 80% of American Jews describe themselves as pro-Israeli. End footnote. Post-colonial theories thus usually completely miss the genuinely anti-Jewish motifs of Christianity, in which the Jews are stylized as demonic murderers of God and children, as, quote, holy executioners, end quote, as Chaim Maccoby specifies this myth. Wikipedia says Chaim Maccoby was a Jewish-British scholar and dramatist specializing in the study of the Jewish and Christian religious traditions. He was known for his theories of the historical Jesus and the origins of Christianity. Back to the text. Footnote. The Christian, quote, doctrine of vicarious atonement, end quote, through Jesus' death on the cross, thus leads to the projective processing of guilt in the Christian community. In the idea of the, quote, human divine sacrifice, lies the moral difficulty, that the initiate is actually glad that the salvific death takes place, since without it he would forego salvation. This joy must, of course, be concealed at all costs, because it cannot be admitted that the initiate and the community to which the initiate belongs are partly responsible for the cruel death through their strong desire and gratitude for it. Consequently, some dark figure of a traitor must be found in whom the bloody deed can be blamed. End quote. Maccoby. What was his name again? Chaim Maccoby. In Christian thought, these traitors, and in this case ultimately even, quote, God killers, are Judas Iscariot and the Pharisees, who are characterized as, quote, terrifying superfathers, end quote, Maccoby. And finally, the Jewish people as a whole. End footnote. The Jews are intended to misheal the central emotional and religious conflict of the Christian community and are indispensable as figures for the attribution of responsibility for Christ's ambivalent atoning sacrifice. In modern anti-Semitism, these stereotypes persist in a secularized form and are linked to the construction of the enemy image of the Jew as a hypermodern, quote, hyper-white, invisible world conspirator standing behind the abstractions of capital and law, in complete contrast to the racist enemy images of Arabs, whose supposedly pre-modern form of communality and rootedness is sometimes even envied by radical right-wingers, implying a, quote, coexistence in racist hierarchy, end quote. Bernstein, 2020. Footnote. On the new rights image of Islam and its interpretation of conservative Islam as an ally and, quote, trusted other, end quote, in the fight against liberal modernity, see Hagedorny, 2022. End footnote. Quote, the Jew, end quote, on the other hand, as a paradoxical figure of the, quote, counter-race, end quote, Horkheimer and Adorno, or the anti-people, destroys every folkish, parenthesis, ethnic, and parenthesis, quote, racial, or otherwise homogeneously imagined identity. Unlike, quote, the Arab, the Jew is not understood as a foreigner invading a community who would have a legitimate place of difference and existence beyond this community, but as an enemy of the peoples as a whole, the blacks or Arabs, quote, are to be kept where they belong, but the earth is to be cleansed of the Jews, end quote. Horkheimer and Adorno, quote, the happiness of the world is to depend on their extermination, end quote. Horkheimer and Adorno. Eugen Düring, who provided, quote, the theoretical tools for entire generations of anti-Semites, end quote. Weber 2020, wrote at the end of the 19th century, quote, the Hebrew tribe, however, is a tangible exception. It is proven to be a materially and spiritually harmful human species to the entire human race. Therefore, in this case, it is not simply a question of the foreignness of a race, but of ancestral and essential depravity. ... The Jewish question is not limited to one people. It is a question of peoples. ... It wants to be answered from an international perspective. End quote. Eugen Düring. Even though Christian hostility existed towards Muslims and Jews alike in the 16th century, albeit the motives were not the same even then, in parentheses, the fundamental difference between anti-Arab racist and anti-Semitic images of the enemy, which can be found in all influential anti-Semites of the 19th and 20th centuries, is ignored in the post-colonial thesis of, quote, anti-Semitism, end quote. Eugen Düring, mentioned above, writes, quote, used in relation to the Jews, the term Semitic easily becomes a euphemism, and the Jews also prefer to put up with it rather than with the name of well-known significance and popular comprehensibility. In fact, whereas in Algeria Arabs oppose the Jews to the same degree as we do, it obscures the true relationship, i.e. the contrast in character between the nationalities. In this case, Jewish Semites are detested by Arab Semites as a harmful tribe, and the term anti-Semitism, which has been foisted on Arab sentiments from Europe, becomes, where it is understood, an obvious ridicule. Various Semitic tribes have a far better character than the Jews, and it is understandable that the Jews like to hide behind a comprehensive race and its name, end quote. Eugen Düring. Theodor Fritsch, whose Handbook of the Jewish Question went through 49 editions by 1944, and who is considered, quote, a key figure in the anti-Semitic movement of the German Empire and Weimar Republic, end quote. Bergman, 2009, is equally unequivocal. Quote, the term, quote, anti-Semitism, end quote, coined by Wilhelm Marr in 1879, is unfortunate insofar as there are other peoples of Semitic language who are in sharp opposition to the Jews. It is therefore not only for reasons of linguistic purity that the term, quote, anti-Semite shall be avoided and replaced by, quote, opponent of the Jews, end quote, Theodor Fritsch. Footnote, Wikipedia says, Theodor Fritsch lived from 1852 to 1933. Theodor Fritsch was a German publisher and journalist. Theodor Fritsch's anti-Semitic writings did much to influence popular German opinion against Jews in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Theodor Fritsch's writings also appeared under the pen names Thomas Frey, Fritz Thor, and Ferdinand Roderick Stoltheim. He is not to be confused with his son, also named Theodor Fritsch, who lived from 1895 to 1946, and also a bookseller who was a member of the paramilitary wing of the Nazi Party, the Sturmabteilung. End footnote. Or back to the text. The influential anti-Semite Houston Stewart Chamberlain, too, writes in his confused treatise, The Foundation of the 19th Century, quote, nor is it at all acceptable to equate the term, quote, Jew, as has been done so often in recent times, with the term, quote, Semite. The national character of the Arabs, for example, is quite different from that of the Jews, end quote. Houston Stewart Chamberlain. Wikipedia says Houston Stewart Chamberlain lived from 1855 to 1927 and was a British, German, French philosopher who wrote works about political philosophy and natural science. Houston Stewart Chamberlain's writing promoted German ethno-nationalism, anti-Semitism, scientific racism, and Nordicism. Houston Stewart Chamberlain has been described as a, quote, racialist writer, end quote. Houston Stewart Chamberlain's best-known book, the two-volume Die Grundlagen des Neunzehnten Jahrhunderts, The Foundations of the 19th Century, published in 1899, became highly influential in the pan-Germanic folkish movements of the early 20th century and later influenced the anti-Semitism of Nazi racial policy. In the early 1920s, Houston Stewart Chamberlain met and encouraged Adolf Hitler. Houston Stewart Chamberlain has been referred to as, quote, Hitler's John the Baptist, end quote. Born in Hampshire in 1884, Houston Stewart Chamberlain settled in Paris and was later naturalized as a French citizen. Houston Stewart Chamberlain emigrated to Dresden in adulthood out of an adoration for composer Richard Wagner. Houston Stewart Chamberlain married Eva von Bülow, Wagner's daughter, in December 1908, 25 years after Wagner's death. During World War I, Houston Stewart Chamberlain sided with Germany against Houston Stewart Chamberlain's country of birth. Houston Stewart Chamberlain took German citizenship in 1916. Back to the text. I want to look up this book as well, actually, because there's a link to it here. The Foundations of the 19th Century, published in 1899, is a racialist book by the British-German philosopher Houston Stewart Chamberlain. In The Foundations of the 19th Century, Houston Stewart Chamberlain advances various racialist and especially folkish anti-Semitic theories on how Houston Stewart Chamberlain saw the Aryan race as superior to others, and the Teutonic peoples as a positive force in European civilization, and the Jews as a negative force. The Foundations of the 19th Century was Houston Stewart Chamberlain's best-selling work. Back to the text. The influential anti-Semite Houston Stewart Chamberlain, too, writes in his confused treatise, The Foundation of the 19th Century, quote, nor is it at all acceptable to equate the term, quote, Jew, as has been done so often in recent times, with the term, quote, Semite. The national character of the Arabs, for example, is quite different from that of the Jews, end quote. Houston Stewart Chamberlain. Section 2. Relativization of the Holocaust. Secondly, anyone who fails to conceptualize anti-Semitism and anti-Semitism's specific declaration of the enemy cannot grasp the particularity of the Holocaust as an intended total, global, and redemptive anti-Semitic practice of extermination beyond all economic, geopolitical, or war strategic rationality criteria. Consequently, its unprecedented nature is questioned in various forms. In doing so, post-colonial theories draw, amongst others, on three approaches: Hannah Arendt's dissolution of the Holocaust into an enterprise reducing human beings to chains of stimulus response, Michel Foucault's theory of biopolitical state racism, and Giorgio Agamben's topos of the modern camp inmate as being reduced to the, quote, living dead, end quote. The specificity of the redemptive anti-Semitism behind the Holocaust, which regarded the Jews as enemies of the peoples who could not be granted a legitimate place on the planet, is dissolved into a so-called biopolitical continuum and qualitatively equated with the, quote, naked life of disenfranchised refugees, colonially governed blacks, and a type of Nazi camp prisoner, the Musulman. Footnote. Quote, Musulman was a common term in Auschwitz for a camp prisoner who was extremely emaciated, close to death, and barely responsive. Later, the term, quote, living dead was also used. End footnote. In all variants of this theory, the intention of total annihilation and the hierarchy of victims established by the Shoah cannot be explained to any extent. Both Arendt and Agamben even declare extermination to be a, quote, epiphenomenon, end quote, while the total domination and reduction of human beings to the aforementioned bare life is supposed to have been the actual intention of the Nazis. For Foucault, the Jews were to be murdered as a symbol of all other races to be destroyed, which is simply historically wrong. The Nazis did not intend to totally destroy all other, quote, races. It is systematically missed that the extermination of the Jews was a total, absolute, and ultimate goal, while the murder of millions of so-called Slavs, for example, was embedded in the war strategic, geopolitical, and economic considerations of the Germans who considered themselves racially superior. The thesis of the common enemy image of Jew/Muslim in alleged, quote, anti-Semitism, end quote, is sometimes taken so far as Gil Anidyar, that it is claimed that Jews were killed in Auschwitz as Muslims. Quote, Jews died, as Muslims, Muselmänner, in Auschwitz, end quote. Anidyar. Here the faded Orientalist etymology of the word, quote, Musulman, end quote, is reinterpreted as an ideological explanation of the enemy. The fact that Hitler and Himmler were enthusiastic about Islam and even set up Muslim SS units under, what's his name? What the fuck is his name? Is it Haj Amin al-Husseini? I think that's his name. The Mufti of Jerusalem. Amin al-Husseini, that's what I meant to say. Amin al-Husseini. Muhammad Amin al-Husseini. Where am I? In fact, that Hitler and Himmler were enthusiastic about Islam and even set up Muslim SS units does not bother Anidyar any more than the fact that most Jews did not even reach the stage of, quote, Musulman, and were instead immediately gassed or shot or beaten to death in downright archaic forms behind the front. The, quote, Musulman is therefore a decidedly atypical figure when it comes to the extermination of Jews. Yeah, I mean, I think especially contemporary research, to some extent, because, like, for a while there was there was rightfully a large focus on the death camps such as Auschwitz, but large numbers of the Jews killed in the Holocaust were like immediately killed, not in the sense of being transported across Europe to different death and concentration camps, but just immediately killed. Once the Einsatzgruppen arrived, and there's this term for it in the historiography called Holocaust by bullets, which kind of speaks to what was just said there. A further motif, developed almost simultaneously in the 1950s by Arendt and Amy Césaire, is that of the boomerang. European colonialism had, according to this thesis, struck back at Europe in the form of the Shoah, and thus stood in a continuum with colonial violence and its ideologies. This idea is widespread among contemporary post-colonialism. Quote, the Shoah has its roots in Southwest Africa, end quote, claims the black French playwright Pende Diouf in a play cited in Cologan. Penda Diouf, Pendadiouf. In a tweet on the commemoration day of the victims of National Socialism, the post-colonial activist Natasha Kelly bluntly speaks of a, quote, African Holocaust. And the German historian Jürgen Zimmerer has been propagating the thesis for 20 years that there is a continuity, quote, from Windhoek to Auschwitz, end quote. Indeed, that the war against the Herero and Nama was, quote, a decisive step, end quote, towards the Holocaust. Sorry, I'm looking up. I didn't really see anything good for Natasha Kelly. It looks like she yeah, I'm not really finding anything simple. Just explaining her, who she is. It says Jürgen Zimmer is a professor of history at the University of Hamburg and was the founding president of the International Network of Genocide Scholars. Back to the text. The colonial experience of being able to annihilate entire peoples had, adopted from Arendt, an influence on the Nazis' extermination of the Jews in the form of personal and institutional continuities or a transfer of ideas, so Zimmerer claims. More recent research, on the other hand, shows that neither significant ideological nor relevant personal and institutional continuities, for example between the genocide of the Herero and the Holocaust, can be proven. Moreover, in German Southwest Africa, or South Africa, despite the extermination order of General von Trotha, which was revoked by the German Kaiser, neither entire peoples were to be annihilated, nor do the camps there have this function of total extermination. And Wikipedia says Lothar von Trotha lived from 1848 to 1920 and was a German military commander during the European New Colonial Era as a brigade commander of the East Asian Expedition Corps. Lothar von Trotha was involved in suppressing the Boxer Rebellion of Qing China, commanding troops which made up the German contribution to the Eight-Nation Alliance. Lothar von Trotha later served as governor of German Southwest Africa and commander-in-chief of its colonial forces, in which role Lothar von Trotha suppressed a native rebellion during the Herero Wars. He was widely condemned for his brutality in the Herero Wars, particularly for his role in the genocide of the Nama, Koko, and the Herero. Back to the text. Unlike the Nazi extermination camps, the concentration camps in South and German Southwest Africa were, quote, attempts to concentrate the population, in the context of colonial wars as a means of ending adamant resistance movements, end quote. Krayenbaum. The concentration camps in South and German Southwest Africa's aim was not, quote, the immediate murder of all those who were sent there, end quote, but a mix of military counterpartisan action by separating civilians and guerrillas, pacification of conflicts through internment and control of the population, exploitation of labor, quote, re-education to, quote, European values, retribution for, quote, insurgent behavior, and repatriation. The majority of researchers also repeatedly point out that the categories of continuity and interconnectedness used by Simmerer, for example, to establish a, quote, link between colonialism and the Holocaust are vague and blurred. According to Roberta Perger and Mark Roseman, European anti-Semitism was not entirely uninfluenced by colonial racism in the 19th century, but in the case of Germany in particular, quote, the shift from religious to ethnically exclusionary forms predated its colonial adventures, end quote. And not only that, but the content and motivational context of national anti-Semitism also managed entirely without recourse to colonial topoi. Says Roberta Perger is assistant professor of history at Indiana University Bloomington, where she teaches classes on modern Europe, the history of empires, the First World War, and Nazi Germany. She has published widely on Italian fascism, imperial formations, and population settlement. And it said Mark Roseman is professor in Jewish studies at Indiana University Bloomington. And if you didn't know, Bloomington, Indiana's college has a big program in anti-Semitism studies. In view of the fact that their continuity claims have proven to be unfounded, authors such as Simmerer or Dirk Moses concede the relevance of anti-Semitic ideology, but attempt to press anti-Semitism into the template of, quote, colonizer versus colonized, end quote, yet again. In response to Moses and Zimmerman's claims that the Holocaust could be understood as colonial, anti-colonial genocide, Perger / Roseman state, quote, Many Germans certainly saw themselves as beleaguered victims, and Jews as somehow linked to Germany's oppression and to its inner weakness. But the Jewish threat was seen as global, insidious, and exercised through disguise and conspiracy, and thus completely unlike the overt, regimented imposition of power experienced by the subalterns of actual empires. End quote. In modern anti-Semitism, Jews undermine precisely the distinction between inside and outside. They are not understood as colonizers coming from a homeland and to be pushed back there, but an invisible, omnipresent enemy of all peoples without the capability to form states. Moreover, there is no real colonial actor, quote, Judaism, with whom a real colonial conflict exists. Anti-Semitism is therefore not a, quote, anti-colonial ideology, end quote. Jews are also not preventatively murdered in the conquered area in the sense of a paranoid security syndrome that can be found in colonial genocides. And that's that I think that's pretty much Dirk Moses' thesis of like genocide, is that or at least part of his thing is the paranoid security syndrome, like the kind of like vision on the part of states of total security, which might make sense in the case of something like the Herero or in Southwest Africa, but is not something that can be attributed to the Holocaust. While colonial massacres are often committed in the course of real territorial, economic, or power political conflicts, acts of obstruction and resistance, these are not present in the case of the extermination of the Jews. For the Nazis, the Jew is the apocalyptic enemy of the peoples, and this by mastering the mechanisms of modernity and perverting them for his destructive, exploitative purposes. His, quote, over-civilization and, quote, rootlessness are therefore the, quote, problem. The alleged partisanship of the Jews in the East is one of those, quote, dressed-up utilitarian legitimization strategies, end quote. Herbert, 1991, with which the Nazis disguised the delusional act of murdering this enemy of the world as a rational military strategy for coping with the situation. In the case of the Holocaust, there were, quote, no real conflicts, end quote, with a, quote, indigenous population, end quote. And, quote, there was also no nation and the colonized, quote, other, facing each other, since the Holocaust was preceded by comprehensive racist, anti-Semitic reformattings of one's own nation, end quote. Bajor and O'Sullivan, 2022. However, it was easier to put into action the unprecedented if it was, quote, justified situationally with unavoidable constraints, end quote, according to Ulrich Herbert. The genuine aim of anti-Semitic violence is also not to transform the Jews into controllable nature or, quote, work animals, end quote, to be dominated or merely to repress them. Anti-Semitism is therefore not a colonial ideology either. Wikipedia says Ulrich Herbert is a German historian and a specialist in the Nazi era and German history during World War II. Ulrich Herbert was professor at the University of Freiburg. In 1999, Herbert received the Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz Prize in Modern and Contemporary History. He edited European History in the 20th Century, a series of 10 surveys by German scholars. His work actually seems really interesting. Back to the text. The reinterpretation of the Holocaust is accompanied by a massive attack on Holocaust remembrance. In conspiracy theory manner, Holocaust remembrance is accused of being controlled and decreed by German, quote, American, British, and Israeli elites, end quote, high priests, end quote, Dirk Moses. It's funny. One of the groups that's kind of like I think that Ingo Elbe has published in them. He's not really like a journalist type, um, which is but in the journal Jungle World, which is like kind of important for the like anti-authoritarian, um, anti-Zionist left in Germany. Uh, Dirk Moses called them Jungle World incels, which is like, are you 5? Are you 5 years old? It's like the woke version of calling someone a pussy. Anyway, it is claimed that Israel perpetually instrumentalizes the memory of the Holocaust in order to draw moral profit from it and to conceal racist crimes. The aim is not merely to criticize specific misleading references to the Holocaust in Israel. Rather, the connection between anti-Semitism as hostility towards Jews, the experience of the Holocaust, and Israel as a protective authority for Jews is fundamentally questioned. Alain Badiou not only claims that Israel would gain a protective shield for its crimes by interpreting the Holocaust as the Shoah, he also believes that the Holocaust must be forgotten as an anti-Jewish crime. Quote, we must manage ... to forget the Holocaust, end quote, in order to resolve the so-called Middle East conflict. Theologian Mark H. Ellis argues similarly, speaking of, quote, ending Auschwitz, end quote. Mark H. Ellis, 1952 to 2024, was an American author, liberation theologian, and retired university professor of Jewish Studies, professor of history, and director for the Center for Jewish Studies at Baylor University. He was visiting professor of several international universities, including the University of Innsbruck, Austria, and the United Nations University for Peace, Costa Rica. Back to the text. The justification for this left-wing, quote, leave the past behind, end quote, Schlussstrich strategy is firstly the relativization of the Shoah as a crime not specifically directed against Jews. Second, the assertion that Arabs and Palestinians have absolutely no connection with the crimes of the Nazis. Footnote, see Badiou, 2011, there is to be, quote, strictly no relation between the Nazis and Palestinians, end quote. Badiou. And thirdly, that it is Israel, as an ethnically based state, that is now continuing the tradition of Nazism. Arab and Islamic anti-Semitism, not a thing. Collaboration of the leader of the Palestinian National Movement, Amin al-Husseini, and other Arab forces with Hitler, not a thing. It was a thing. Mass dissemination of anti-Semitic literature in the Arab world, not at all. The de facto end of the possibility of European Jews fleeing to Palestine since the British White Paper policy from 1939 onwards due to Arab terror, no trace. Nowadays, conspiracy ideologies are widespread in this progressive milieu. For example, the conspiracy theory statements by anti-Zionist activist Avraham Berg on the Central Council of Jews in 2022 were uncritically disseminated on Twitter by FAZ journalist Joseph Kreuteru and ultimately reprinted in the Berliner Zeitung. I'm not sure who this is referring to here. Sorry. Yeah, sorry, I'm not finding good stuff here. For example, the conspiracy statements by anti-Zionist activist Avraham Berg on the Central Council of Jews in 2022 were uncritically disseminated on Twitter by FAZ journalist Joseph Koiteru and ultimately reprinted in the Berliner Zeitung. The background to this was the criticism by representatives of the Central Council of openly anti-Israel contributions at the, quote, hijacking memory conference organized by the Center for Research on Antisemitism, ZFA, among others. In Koiteru's translation of a Haaretz article by Avraham Berg, it says, quote, Israel's deep right directs the policies of the state of #Israel. Israel shapes the position of the Central Council, and the Central Council in turn dictates the most sensitive German political discourse. Thus, the conservative and racist Israeli right determines the German nature of emotions and feelings regarding Germany's past, Jews, anti-Semites, and the state of Israel. End quote. Avraham Berg. In view of the not infrequently encountered, quote, leave the past behind, end quote, mentality in Germany, the massive support of Palestinian forces by the German government, and the spread of Israel-related anti-Semitism in all political camps, such ideas of prescribed catechisms, dictated discourses, and feelings determined by Israel can only be described as absurd. Even if, quote, Israeli machinations, end quote, are not directly invoked, representatives of this milieu like to indulge in the typical pose of the victim threatened by censorship and political pressure. An article in the Süddeutsche Zeitung on the current debate reads, quote, Stephanie Schuler-Springorum, director of the Center for Research on Antisemitism, also described a disturbing consequence of the situation. Really controversial discussions on the debate could only really be held behind closed doors at her institution at the moment, end quote. One hardly dares to imagine what is being discussed, quote, behind closed doors, given the ZFA openly presents radical anti-Israeli propagandists such as Turek Bakoni and Peter Beinart on the large and lavishly financed stage of the House of World Cultures in Berlin. Wikipedia says, House of World Cultures in Berlin is Germany's national center for the presentation and discussion of international contemporary arts, with a special focus on non-European cultures and societies. It presents art exhibitions, theater and dance performances, concerts, author readings, films, and academic conferences on visual art and culture. It is one of the institutions which, due to their national and international standing and the quality of their work, receive funding from the federal government as so-called, quote, lighthouses of culture, end quote, from the Federal Ministry of State for Culture and the Media, as well as from the Federal Foreign Office. As a venue and collaboration partner, the House of World Cultures has hosted festivals such as the Transmediale or Medial, curatorial platforms, biennials such as the Berlin Documentary Forum, and mentorship programs such as Forecast. Since 2013, the House of World Culture's interdisciplinary elaboration on the Anthropocene discourse has included conferences, exhibitions, and other artistic formats performed together with philosophers, scientists, and artists such as Bruno Latour and Hans Joachim Schönhuber. And Tarek Bakoni is the bio from Al-Shabaka, the Palestinian Policy Network. Tarek Bakoni serves as the president of the board of Al-Shabaka. He was Al-Shabaka's U.S. Policy Fellow from 2016 to 2017. Tarek is the former senior analyst for Israel-Palestine and economics of conflict at the International Crisis Group based in Ramallah, and the author of Hamas Contained, The Rise and Pacification of Palestinian Resistance, published at Stanford University Press. Tarek Bakoni's writings have appeared in the London Review of Books, the New York Review of Books, the Washington Post, among others, and he is a frequent commentator in regional and international media. He is the book review editor for the Journal of Palestinian Studies. And who's into Peter Beinart? Peter Beinart, born 1971, is an American liberal columnist and journalist and political commentator, a former editor of the New Republic. He has also written for Time, The Atlantic, the New York Review of Books, among other periodicals. He has written 4 books. He is a professor of journalism and political science at the Craig Newark Graduate School of Journalism at the City University of New York. He is an editor-at-large at Jewish Currents, a contributing opinion columnist at the New York Times, a political commentator for MSNBC, and a fellow at the Foundation for the Middle East. Back to the text. Finally, Michael Rothberg and Jürgen Simmerer fantasize about a taboo, even a, quote, ban on any comparison and correlation, end quote, of the Shoah and other mass crimes. Michael Rothberg is an American literature and memory studies scholar. He is a professor of English and comparative literature and the 1939 Society Samuel Goetz Chair in Holocaust Studies at the University of California, Los Angeles. He was a founding director of the Initiative in Holocaust, Genocide, and Memory Studies at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Back to the text. Henning Melber and Reinhard Kusler not only speak of the, quote, taboo of comparison, but they also suspect that criticism of anti-Semitism is a, quote, immunization strategy against, end quote, against coming to terms with the German colonial crimes and taking other victim groups of the Holocaust into account. Wikipedia says Henning Melber, born 1950, is a German political scientist and sociologist. Henning Melber is a German, Namibian, and Swedish Africanist and political activist. And Reinhard Kusler is a German sociologist. Meanwhile, Charlotte Weidemann believes, quote, "It certainly does not become anybody to use the attribute of the singularity of the Holocaust as a weapon, as a dogma to which anyone who does not want to be seen as anti-Jewish or cold-hearted must bow down. ... The term singularity is also problematic if it results in the exclusivity of Jewish victims." End quote. Weidemann. Charlotte Weidemann is a German prize-winning journalist and author. Charlotte Weidemann is mainly known for her reports and essays as freelance journalist for German and Swiss German news media. Based on her frequent travels to African and Middle Eastern countries, she also authored several non-fiction books. In these, she discussed the perception of political events such as the Holocaust and the Nakba, changes in the political situation in Mali, Iran, North Africa, as well as Western domination and white journalist views on non-white societies. Back to the text. As for prominent British activist Jackie Walker, the Holocaust is only taken so seriously anyway because the principle applies, quote, "it's white lives that matter," end quote. While the Islamic activist Huria Boutelja, I can't pronounce that name. It's my best to pronounce it anyway. Who is courted by post-colonial star theorists such as Cornel West, Traverso, or Gross-Fogel, says, quote, for the South, the Shoah, ... is nothing but a, quote, detail, end quote. End quote. Boutelja, 2016. The originally radical right-wing topoi of a, quote, taboo, pronounced by Zionists, the, quote, Auschwitz cudgel, end quote, the Auschwitz Keule, the Holocaust is a mere, quote, detail of history, end quote, Jean-Marie Le Pen, and the, quote, privileged Jewish victims have thus finally arrived on the left. Wikipedia says Jacqueline Walker is a British political activist and writer. She has been a teacher and anti-racism trainer. Jackie Walker is the author of a family memoir, Pilgrim State, and the co-writer and performer of a one-woman show, The Lynching. Jackie Walker held the roles of vice chair of South Thanet Constituency Labour Party and vice chair of Momentum before being suspended and ultimately expelled from the party for misconduct. Where am I? Isn't Horia Boutelja, isn't that the person from like the Republic of the Indigenous or whatever? Or is that someone else? Horia Boutelja is a French Algerian political activist. She served as spokesperson for the indigenous de la République until 2020. And just real quick, look up what that group's about. Indigène de la République is the generic name for a call, it's an association and then a political movement that appeared in 2005 in France, which became a political party defining itself as anti-racist and, quote, decolonial. It considers that racial discrimination in France is omnipresent and structural because it is linked to its colonial past. Some sources describe the Party of the Indigenous Peoples of the Republic as anti-feminist, anti-Semitic, homophobic, identitarian, Islamo-leftist, racialist, and racist. However, the PIR and its spokespersons are defended by academics and activists who refute these accusations in several columns and articles. Okay. So I think that'll be part 1 maybe of the essay, or maybe I'll make it a full video. Depends on how long I've been reading here. Okay, we're at 111 minutes, or an hour and 11 minutes. So we'll probably need to make at least 2 of these.